Welcome back to our series on the most important battles in the Civil War. In the last episode, we talked about military technology, military tactics, particularly informed by Napoleon, and the lead up to the Peninsula Campaign, and how General McClellan is dragging his feet at a glacially slow pace, taking 6 months, even longer, to finally get out of Washington and move south. We're finally moving south. Now we're seeing the first extended Union campaign in the East. The goal is to capture Richmond, and McClellan and the Union Army have landed near Richmond. They're marching, and they're within 80 miles. Their goal, taking another page from Napoleon's playbook, is to have a decisive victory by quickly penetrating into enemy territory. Well, let's see what happens. Spoiler alert, there's not going to be a decisive Union victory in 1862. So, James, how does this campaign begin?
All right. Well, you summed it up really well as to what's been going on. McClellan came up with this idea to do a huge flanking movement to go completely around the Confederate Army, which was originally at Manassas Junction, not far from Washington. So they went by water. They went down. He put 70,000 men on boats. They went down the Potomac into the Chesapeake Bay, down around to the southeast part of Virginia, and they landed at Fort Monroe, which was still held by the Union. It was one of the few federal installations in the South that was not captured by the Confederacy. It was just too strong. So they used that as a base, Fort Monroe, between the York River and the James River. And McClellan's plan is to march up the peninsula and get behind Joseph Johnston's army, which he's essentially already done, and march into Richmond. But Joseph Johnston is going to have a thing or two to say about that. He's not just going to let McClellan just stroll into Richmond. He's going to put up a fight. So we'll see how that works. All right. So we're going to go to late March, early April of 1862 now. McClellan had his 70,000 men at Fort Monroe, and he gets another 30,000, bringing his total strength to 100,000. Johnston didn't have anywhere near that. He had far fewer. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but many fewer, like maybe 60, 70,000. I may be a little off on that, but that's a ballpark figure. The Union Army definitely outnumbered the Confederate Army, and that's true in almost every battle throughout the entire war. All right, so McClellan starts marching up the peninsula. If we do our mental map of Virginia, he's on the right side of Virginia, and he's going roughly toward the west. If you do your mental map, he's moving from the right side with the ocean. He's moving to our left toward Richmond. And he goes up the peninsula, and he gets to the town of Yorktown, Virginia. And yes, folks, it's that Yorktown. The Yorktown.
Defeated the British there at Yorktown.
Yeah. Well, there's no British this time. Instead, there's a bunch of Confederates. But this is the same Yorktown where George Washington had trapped the British Army during the American Revolutionary War and caused them to surrender, ending the war essentially. But anyway, but from the beginning, there are a lot of problems. The Union generals that are commanding McClellan's corps and his divisions, actually, they don't really have corps yet. They just have divisions and brigades and regiments like we talked about a while back. But anyway, the top brass are forced. They don't have good maps, so they have to buy maps at the store. I have to go into to the drugstore. Do you have any maps? Okay, here. And sometimes the maps were wrong, and so they kept getting lost. So that's one reason McClellan is forced to go so slow. Part of it is in his nature. He's just not a really super aggressive general, but it definitely doesn't help your cause if your army's getting lost all the time. Another problem is that there was a lot of rain. This is spring. April showers bring May flowers, but they also bring very muddy roads, and there weren't any decent roads in this part of the country. And so the roads turn into muck and quagmire, and they're barely passable. So it takes McClellan's army a long time just to march a few miles a day. And they get to Yorktown, and at Yorktown, there's only 11,000 Confederates. So we're talking almost a 10-to-1 advantage. The Union, if they had had a more aggressive commander, they could have shattered this position. To be fair, the Confederates are dug in. They have some fortifications that they've put up. But still, I mean, there's almost 10 Union soldiers for every Confederate soldier. But the Confederates are commanded by a very interesting man called John B. Magruder. And John Magruder had a definite flair for the dramatic. Magruder, in fact, he was called Prince John by his soldiers because he had this princely air, and he would have been a great actor. He would have had a great career as in the theater, perhaps. Magruder resorts to a variety of techniques to fool McClellan into thinking the Confederate force was much larger than it really was. He would have some of his subordinate officers. They would go out into the woods and bark orders at a bunch of soldiers that weren't even there. He would have some of his other officers take one regiment and just march it by and march it in a circle. They would go by where the Union people could see them and then go back when they were out of sight, circle around, come back again. So it looked like you just had this nonstop parade of soldiers when in fact it was the same guys coming through again and again. They would have.
This is like a Mel Brooks gag.
I know, right?
Have removable mustaches or something to look different each time.
Exactly. He was a master of. You could almost call this psychological warfare. Deception. He had campfires lit in places where there were no troops, but the Union officers would see the campfires and say, "Oh, there's 1,000 guys there, or 10,000." There would be tents pitched where there was nobody. And my favorite technique was called the Quaker gun. Magruder would get a great big log, have it painted black, and put it up and make it look like it's a cannon. And so the Union scouts would see these, and they were too far away to tell that they were just logs, but they looked like a lot of extra cannon that they didn't have. And so McClellan was very reluctant to attack. He thought the Confederates had 100 to even sometimes he would thought maybe up to 200,000 soldiers in front of him, which was ridiculous. And McClellan was just the right commander for the Confederates, at least from the Confederate standpoint, because he wanted to be fooled. That's what one professor I was listening to said. He wanted to be fooled. He didn't really want to attack. So he decides to lay siege to Yorktown. In other words, just put it under siege, surround it, although it's not a true siege because you can't completely encircle it, although the Union is using their fleet to try to get control of the rivers. But so it's not a true siege. It's kind of a one-sided siege, but he's just basically standing there and firing a lot of cannonballs into the Confederate position and hoping the Confederates will withdraw or surrender. Well, they definitely don't surrender. And this siege is maintained for a month, a whole month. McClellan just sits there camped in front of Yorktown. Lincoln is practically begging McClellan to attack. Lincoln, it wasn't his style to give orders. He didn't like to just say, "All right, you are ordered now to do this." He would use suggestions, and he would send messages like, "This might be a good time to go ahead and move in and attack." But McClellan was having nothing of it. And after about a month, before I say that, let me give you a quote from the Confederate overall commander, General Johnston, that we've talked about several times. General Joseph Johnston said, "Only McClellan would not have attacked us." And so the Confederates pulled back. McClellan slowly advanced. He was just afraid that these 100,000 or 150, 200,000 Confederates were going to wipe him out. So they're slowly moving forward, and he gets there and he realizes they're gone. The Confederates have completely pulled out. So they fooled him. They held him off for a whole month just by trickery. And his subordinate, Philip Kearny was a Union general. He had been a general in the Mexican War also. He called McClellan the Virginia Creeper. This is his own subordinate.
So he's getting the reverse treatment of McClellan calling Lincoln the original guerrilla. Yeah. So karma has come back.
McClellan was just not a nice guy, at least not to people he didn't respect. And he didn't like a lot of people. He didn't like Lincoln. He didn't like Edwin Stanton, who by now was the Secretary of War. He hated Winfield Scott and was very critical of them all. Just really just nasty, say ugly things. All right, so there we are. We've left McClellan. He's just taken Yorktown. He's about halfway up the peninsula. Richmond is still quite a ways away, but he's much closer to Richmond now. Uh, Meanwhile, let's move over to the western part of Virginia, or more western, west of Richmond, to the Shenandoah Valley. The Shenandoah Valley is it kind of runs from roughly north-south, although it's really more southwest to northeast. So think of a slightly slanted line, and you have the Blue Ridge Mountains on one side and the Alleghenies on the other side. And it's a very fertile area. It's a beautiful area. Have you ever been to Shenandoah, Scott?
Can't say that I have, no.
Well, if you ever, not if, but when you go to Virginia, definitely at least drive through it. I've driven through it. I haven't actually stopped. There's a national park there now, but I want to go, and hopefully I will pretty soon. But anyway, it's a great place for the Confederacy to do some operations that'll distract the Union, because it juts right up to the Potomac. When you enter the valley at the south and then you move toward Washington, that's actually down the valley. It's confusing because you're moving north on the map, and most people think if you're going north, you're going up. But they say up the valley is actually south. Anyway, so they send Jackson over there, and Jackson is threatening to get up to the Potomac and possibly even get into Maryland and head to Washington. So the Union can't just ignore Stonewall Jackson in the valley. Jackson had a motto about warfare, and I want to quote this. I'm going to leave out some of it. It's a very long quote, I hate listening to long quotes myself, so I'm going to cut it down to the essentials. But this is what Jackson said about war. Jackson said, "Always mystify, mislead, and surprise the enemy if possible. And when you strike and overcome him, never let up in the pursuit so long as your men have strength to follow. A small army may thus destroy a large one in detail, and repeated victory will make it invincible." And that's exactly what Jackson's going to do in the valley. I like that phrase: mystify, mislead, and surprise the enemy. I won't go into detail, but this is Jackson's military masterpiece. Jackson and his men, they march all up and down the valley. He has a small army. He's got, I can't remember, he's got about maybe 10,000. I can't remember what did I say? Well, anyway, it doesn't matter. 10 to 14,000. I didn't write it down, which is a mistake when you're my age, but I don't have it memorized. But a quite small army. And he marches it, and he strikes all the Union forces in the area. Remember that there's a force under Fremont in West Virginia. There's a force under Nathaniel Banks at the north part of the valley. McDowell has troops to the east of the valley, north of Richmond. And Jackson he disappears, and then he pops up in surprise, and he attacks one Union force and defeats them. And then he goes another place, and there's a kind of a ridge that goes up and down the Shenandoah right in the middle, and he uses that to screen his movements and disguise them. He's got cavalry helping him out. He's helped by the fact that we've talked about the horrible roads, but in the Shenandoah, you had what was called the Shenandoah Pike, and it was a macadamized road, which means it was almost like cobblestone. So it wasn't quite as well. It wasn't nearly as impacted by rain. It stayed relatively dry because the rain, when it came down, it would go off to the sides and drain away. So you're marching on rocks, flat rocks, of course, and Jackson marches in just a month or so. He marches over 350 miles. He strikes all the Union forces in the area, and he ties them down. So none of them could assist McClellan. McClellan this whole time is whining and begging and demanding for reinforcements. Remember, he constantly feels like he's outnumbered. And he says, "Send me some of McDowell's men. Send me some of McDowell's men." And some of them start to go. And then it looks like Jackson's going to pop out of the valley and head toward Washington. So those guys are recalled. And what Jackson does, other than the military genius, is he ties down these Union armies. And so they can't do anything. They have to sit there and just be ready for they don't know where he's going to come out. They don't know what he's going to do. So they have to be prepared, and they have to stay there and make sure Jackson doesn't pull any funny stuff. So Jackson really buys a lot of time for Joseph Johnston. It also lifts Confederate morale. And he also inflicts 7,000 casualties, and he seizes huge quantities of badly needed supplies. And this is just in about a month's time period. We're going to see this. This is a theme that goes throughout the Civil War. The South often usually is struggling to feed its soldiers, to clothe them, to equip them. And so anytime they can get their hands on supplies, take them away from the Union, that is a big bonus for them. Finally, Jackson is ordered back to join Johnston's forces, so he leaves the valley and he marches southeast down to link up with Joseph Johnston. He's going to fight when McClellan finally does attack. And so let's get to that.
Well, yeah, just one thing with that I want to mention. One of the masterstrokes of Grant later on when he assumes control is to cut off the logistics chain in the West for the South. But also, I mean, just getting back to McClellan, for Jackson to be able to strike all of these units that are independent, that McClellan, again, imagining himself to be a Napoleon and having the flexibility of all of these separate armies, you can use a playbook of a genius, but if you don't match up with the correct temperament, then it's going to fail. And Stonewall Jackson, using subterfuge, using moving very quickly with a smaller force, seems to have the absolute perfect temperament as a Confederate general.
Yeah, he's exactly what was needed at the time. That's a good observation. And one thing I forgot to mention is, piggybacking on what you said, he really did move very, very quickly. And his armies would march 35, 40 miles a day. And they gained the nickname foot cavalry because they were so fast. They was like, dang, are you sure these guys don't have horses?
Yeah, there's a phrase in Latin of when a Roman army would move at a terrible clip covering 28, 30 miles a day. I forget it, but you're just running them ragged, whatever the Latin equivalent would be, and they're beating that by even 10 more miles.
Right, and these guys were very worn out by the end of the Valley campaign, and they have to book it on down to the Richmond area, which is a pretty good distance, and we're going to see that their exhaustion is going to play a role in the upcoming battles that we're about to talk about. They were worn out, but they were also very in good spirits. You know, it's amazing what winning will do for your morale, because Jackson didn't usually lose. He won almost every engagement that he participated in the Valley campaign. That's a fascinating thing, and if our listeners are interested, I encourage them to do a little more reading or research just on the Valley campaign. You could do a whole lecture on that or a whole episode, but for the sake of time, we'll go back down to the Richmond area. Okay, so McClellan has just been duped with his 100,000 guys into laying siege to a position with 11,000 Confederates, plus about 100,000 imaginary Confederates. So maybe they were zombies like in the Vampire Hunter movie. I don't know. But anyway, so McClellan finally gets up closer to Richmond. He's getting really, really close. They're getting to the point where they can start to hear the chimes. They can hear the church bells. They can hear the clocks chiming, and they can see some of the spires off in the distance. And they're on the outskirts of Richmond. Johnston could not retreat any further without having to submit to a siege. And you never want to undergo a siege if you can help it, because you almost always lose, especially in the Civil War.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
War has played a key role in the history of the United States, from the nation's founding right down to the present. Wars made the United States independent, kept it together, increased its size, and established it as a global superpower. Hi, I'm James Early, host of the Key Battles of American History podcast. In each episode, I discuss American history through the lens of the most important battles of America's wars. To start listening now, go to parthenonpodcast.com or search Key Battles of American History on your favorite podcasting platform.
The History of North America podcast is a sweeping historical saga of the United States, Canada, and Mexico, from their deep origins to our present epoch. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this exciting, fascinating, epic journey through time, focusing on the compelling, wonderful, and tragic stories of North America's inhabitants, heroes, villains, leaders, environment, and geography. I invite you to come along for the ride.
I'm Scott from the History Unplugged podcast. History can be a bit of a tongue twister with its weird-sounding names of people, places, and things, but it really isn't that confusing. History is the story of who we are and how we comport ourselves while soaring to victory in battles over forts, seaports, and cities that fortunately thwarted the schemes of villains and their blood sports, like the 1415 Battle of Agincourt. It's about legal battles in courts, about the contortion of torts over the retorts of consorts that turned into kangaroo courts. I exhort you to listen to History Unplugged on the podcast player of your choice, and you can listen to it while wearing shirts, shorts, skirts, skirts, or jean jorts.
Now, McClellan had deployed about 1/3 of his army south of the Chickahominy River, which is a river that runs near Richmond, and about between the York and the James, so it's in the middle of the peninsula that he's marching up. And he had about 2/3 of his army north of the river. The reason he did this, and the river's really swelled. Remember, this is spring where there's a lot of rain, and it's almost like he's got two separate armies. They're cut off from each other, the 1/3 and the 2/3. And he had to do this for supply reasons. I won't go into that. But Johnston, he decides he's going to attack the 1/3 of the Union Army that was south of the Chickahominy. He thought, well, the 2/3, the big part that's north, we'll just kind of stare them down and keep them a little bit busy, but we'll do our main attack on the small part that's south of the river, and the northern part won't be able to help them. So, good plan. However, it doesn't work because the Confederates did not execute Johnston's plan well. Remember that the troops are still pretty green. Most of these guys hadn't seen hardly any combat, if any at all. So there's a battle, and the battle is called Fair Oaks or Seven Pines. This is another one of the battles that has two names, one Confederate name and one Union name. And the battle ends up being a tactical draw. Johnston hits the Confederates. Hits the Union Army, but the Union fights back really well. Neither side really gains much of an advantage. And there's about 5,000 casualties on each side. So that's a pretty bloody battle for nothing to happen. However, I said nothing happened, but that's not technically correct. Although it was a tactical draw, there were a couple of major consequences. And let me tell you what those are. First of all, McClellan. This is McClellan's first real massive combat operation that he's involved in. And McClellan is shaken. He's shaken by the great carnage. And he said to one of his, I think this is in a letter to his wife, if I remember correctly. He said, "Victory has no charms for me when purchased at such a cost." So McClellan he looked around, and remember we talked about McClellan loved his army, probably loved it a little bit too much. He saw his soldiers as his sons in a sense, and he couldn't handle the sight of so many of them, thousands of them lying around dead or at least wounded. And so he kind of loses it. He's shaken up. I mean, he didn't have a killer instinct to start with, but now he's a changed man. He's kind of freaking out a little bit. He gets maybe what we would call today a little bit of PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. Just really shaken by this, and he doesn't have any more will to fight. The second major outcome of this battle is that Joseph Johnston, the commander of the Confederate Army, he was terribly wounded, and he's going to be out of action for several months. So Johnston has to be replaced, and Jefferson Davis replaces him with another Virginian, a fellow that I'm sure our listeners have heard of. His name is Robert E. Lee. Dun, 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 dun. Yes, cue the music. Cue the heroic music. So Robert E. Lee, this is where Lee, we haven't mentioned Lee a whole lot so far, but this is where Lee takes over as the commander of the Confederate Army in Virginia. In fact, the name of the army is the Army of Northern Virginia. And let me sketch out Lee a little bit. Let me give some background on Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was born in 1806. He was actually older than Abraham Lincoln. He was born into a distinguished family. The Lees were very distinguished family in Virginia, a leading planter family. Robert E. Lee's father was Henry Lee, who had the nickname Light Horse Harry Lee. He was a very effective and famous cavalry commander in the Revolutionary War. He was a founder of the nation. And in fact, he was the one who gave the eulogy, or one of the eulogies at least, at George Washington's funeral in 1799. Light Horse Harry Lee was the man who had said that Washington was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. That's a famous statement that most people have heard. That was Robert E. Lee's father. So Lee was raised in a very prestigious and high class and wealthy family, but unfortunately they didn't stay wealthy for very long because Robert E. Lee's father, Light Horse Harry, was a terrible manager of money. He ended up, I think he was in debtor's prison for a while, and the family, they weren't dirt poor or anything, but they weren't as wealthy as some other leading Virginia families. And the father was gone a lot of the time. He died when Robert E. Lee was pretty young. So it's not like Robert E. Lee was raised with a silver spoon in his mouth, completely at least. Robert E. Lee went to West Point and he graduated second in his class, kind of like McClellan. Robert E. Lee was a brilliant student. He was put into the engineers, which was a great honor. He served ably in the Mexican War. He was on the staff of General Scott. And then he served as a cavalry officer. He served in Texas for a while. He was a colonel in the Union Army by the time the Civil War broke out. He was one of the people that did not leave the Army. We talked about how a lot of West Point people who later became Civil War generals had left the Army in the 1850s. Robert E. Lee stayed in the Army. And we saw in our first episode that Lincoln wanted Robert E. Lee to be the supreme commander of all the Union forces, but Robert E. Lee was not willing to fight against his native state of Virginia, so he declined and became a Confederate general. Lee had, and Lee's early military career as a Confederate general was not all that distinguished. He had gone out in West Virginia and had lost a battle there, although it wasn't necessarily his fault. It was more of his subordinates that really screwed it up. Lee had gone down to the sea coast, like in the Carolinas, South Carolina and the Georgia area, and he'd helped shore up Confederate defenses there. Then he was recalled to Richmond and he became Jefferson Davis's military advisor, kind of like he was just a desk general at that point, an advisor to Jefferson Davis. And he'd overseen the fortifications around Richmond. He helped see that those were built, and people called him the King of Spades. When he was in West Virginia, they called him Granny Lee. So he did not have a great reputation when he was appointed. And I know a lot of people must have said, oh, no, not that guy. Of course, they're going to change their mind pretty quickly. And just to back me up on that, there was a Richmond newspaper that ran an article about this when Robert E. Lee was appointed, and they said, now our army will never be allowed to fight. They just thought Lee was going to be kind of like McClellan, but we'll see that's not going to happen. And this is what McClellan wrote. When McClellan found out that Lee had replaced Johnston, he said, I prefer Lee to Johnston. Lee is too cautious and weak under grave responsibility. Personally brave and energetic to a fault, he is yet wanting in moral firmness when pressed by heavy responsibility.
Oh, that's so much irony. I mean,
Yep.
Well, first of all, for the Richmond newspaper, because Lee, leading the Army of Northern Virginia, he focuses on it almost to a violent exclusion of the rest of the Confederacy in the war. So Richmond's going to see plenty of action. But, I mean, as we've mentioned, that Lee is not cautious. The criticism against him today is that he's too aggressive. He's not fighting to win. He wants the Union only needs to win a war of attrition. They just have to have the Confederacy lose enough forces. The Union is the Scipio Africanus to the Hannibal of Carthage, to any ancient military fans out there, where Lee might be brilliant on the battlefield, but in terms of a total national strategy, a bit lacking. But not lacking at all. And in fact, he leads these cavalry charges that we mentioned in the previous episode with new, more accurate technology with rifled muskets instead of smoothbore muskets can be quite deadly. But yeah, people are going to see the real Lee pretty soon. And we'll talk about him at length in later episodes.
Yeah, he's going to have a big future in our series.
Yeah, I mean, on the battlefield, but then also digging into him in general, his characteristics. Historians love to compare him to Grant, and we'll do some of that too.
Yeah.
But we'll definitely be coming back to him.
Yeah, he's a fascinating character. When Lee read what McClellan had written, he said, I prefer Lee to Johnston. Lee is too cautious and weak under grave responsibility. Lee wrote back and said, well, that's the pot calling the kettle black. No, I'm kidding. Okay. Just kidding. He didn't do that, but he probably just kind of chuckled. All right, so let's see how cautious and weak Lee is. So Lee takes command after the Battle of Seven Pines or Fair Oaks, which takes place on May 31st, 1862. And morale was very low among the Confederates. Lee reorganizes the army. He recalls Jackson. As I mentioned earlier, Jackson is brought back from the valley, and Lee's army reaches a size of about 90,000. Okay, so we've got the Union has around 100,000, maybe a little bit more. Lee has 90,000. So they're almost even Steven. But as we're going to see, Lee was much more aggressive than Johnston. Okay, Johnston was pretty aggressive. He was pretty good, but Lee is super aggressive. He believes in staying on the offensive. All right, McClellan repositioned his army. He had before 1/3 of the army south of the Chickahominy River, and he had 2/3 north of it. Now he shifts it southward so that 2/3 is south and 1/3 is north. And like I said, remember, they're very close to Richmond. It's just like victory is in his grasp. If McClellan could just press on and launch an attack and just do something aggressive, then there's a good chance McClellan can take Richmond and at least push the Confederates off the field of battle, maybe not destroy the army. It's kind of hard to destroy an army of 90,000 people, but maybe they could capture a lot of it. So let's see what McClellan does. Well, the short answer is nothing. McClellan is just sitting there. He's shaken up, as we saw by the Battle of Seven Pines. Meanwhile, Lee sends his chief of cavalry. I hate it when people say cavalry.
Yeah, I have to say, I messed that up for way too long. So cavalry, if you're in a church or Sunday school, perfect. Messing up with cavalry, not so much.
Right. Cavalry is the hill on which Christ was crucified, but guys on horses with guns and swords, that's cavalry.
Cavalry, yes, do not mess that up with the history professor. He will roll his eyes at you, as I have done. It
comes from a French word like chevalier or something like that, but I'm not a French scholar. Okay, so Lee's chief of cavalry is a guy named J.E.B. Stuart, James Ewell Brown Stuart. And Stuart is also a very colorful character. Stuart had a flair for the dramatic. He saw himself as the modern embodiment of the knights of old. He was chivalrous. He wore a feather in his cap and a big feather plume, and he wore a fancy uniform, and he was just like Mr. Southern Gentleman. And he also was very fond of horses and very fond of cavalry. So Stuart, and he's young, he's like 28 years old at the time. Stuart takes a detachment of cavalry and he rides all the way around the Federal Army, does a complete circle around, and he gathers intelligence. We talked about this in our last episode, what the role of cavalry was in the Civil War. Stuart's job is he's the intelligence. He's military intelligence of the time. His own father-in-law had stayed loyal to the Union, and he led the Federal cavalry force that tried to stop him, but they weren't able to stop Stuart. Stuart and the South in general had a great advantage at the beginning of the war in cavalry. They tended to almost literally ride circle. Well, this time they did ride a circle around the Union Army, didn't they? Literally and figuratively. Over the course of the war, we're going to see that's going to even out some. But for now, Stuart is the man. So Stuart tells Lee what the situation is. He tells about how many soldiers the Federals have and where they're located. Lee decides to launch an attack on the Federal right. This is the soldiers north of the river. So this is the north wing. Think about two armies lined up roughly north to south. Lee is on the left, and the Federals under McClellan are on the right. Well, Lee is going to hit the top part of the Union Army, which is north of the river, and Jackson's soldiers were supposed to come in and play a major role. He thought, I've got Jackson back. Jackson's pretty kick butt. We ought to push these guys back, no problem. And so the battles begin. The Federals actually do a minor attack on June 25th, at Oak Grove, but Lee pushes them back, and then Lee totally goes on the offensive. On the 26th, Lee attacks, this is the 26th of June, Lee attacks the Federals at Mechanicsville, but Jackson doesn't show up. Jackson's kind of taking his time. Jackson's worn out. He's literally taking naps during this battle, and he's not sending his army out. So the Confederate attack is repulsed. Then on the 27th, the next day, Lee attacks again at Gaines Mill, which is a little bit further to the east, to the right on our mental map. And there the rebels push back the Union troops. This is a Confederate victory. And a key role was played by General John Bell Hood. John B. Hood and the Texas Brigade. I got to do a shout out to the Texas Brigade. Hood, we're going to see Hood later on, is going to play a major role. He is from Kentucky, but he commands a brigade which is made up almost entirely of Texas soldiers. And in this battle on the 27th, Jackson is supposed to play a key role, but again, he's very sluggish. He performs poorly. It's kind of like all of a sudden McClellan has taken over Jackson's body or something. Jackson is just not performing well. The Federals do retreat across the Chickahominy, so finally their entire force is now united. No more river in the middle. And this is, by the way, the Gaines Mill. This is the third action of the, we're going to call this the 7 days battle because they take place over roughly 7 days. Gaines Mill, this one, is the biggest of the 7 days battles, and it's the largest Confederate attack of the entire war. It was also the only Confederate victory in the 7 days. All right, McClellan, even though he pushed the Federal, he was pushed back a little, but he's going to retreat. He's doing Lee's bidding for him. Lee's trying to push the Federals back all the way back to Fort Monroe and hopefully off the peninsula. And McClellan says, fine, if that's what you want, I'll move back. No, he doesn't say that, but he's trying to get a better defensive position. But the momentum has shifted. Lee has taken the initiative. He's on the offensive. McClellan is on the defensive, and that's the opposite of what it's supposed to be, at least from the Union perspective. There's no fighting on the 28th, but on the 29th and the 30th, Lee attacks again 2 more times. He attacks at Savage Station. He attacks at Glendale, which is also called Fraser's Farm. The Confederates don't perform all that well, but McClellan continues to retreat. He goes back to a position called Malvern Hill, and as you can imagine, because it is a hill, it's a good defensive position. The Confederates will have to go up the hill to get to the Union soldiers, and that's exactly what Lee does. On the July 1st, Lee attacks the Federals at Malvern Hill, but again, the attack was poorly coordinated. Lee's new to commanding this big of an army, and he's having trouble getting his subordinates to do what he wants them to do. And so the Confederates just march up the hill and they just get slaughtered by the Union troops who are on the defensive. General D.H. Hill, he's a Confederate division commander. He said that Malvern Hill was not war, it was murder. This was a huge mistake, at least in my opinion, on Lee's part, because the Confederates take a lot of casualties. Now, since the Union forces pushed back the Confederates, McClellan's subordinates urge him to lead a counterattack. They say, look, we just drove them off the hill. Let's go back and hit them while they're down. But McClellan refuses. He was a beaten man. Instead of going forward toward Richmond and toward Lee's army, he retreats even further away to Harrison's Landing. General Philip Kearny, the general that had criticized McClellan earlier, he said later, we ought, instead of retreating, to follow up the enemy and take Richmond. I say to all of you, such an order can only be prompted by cowardice or treason. So we're starting to hear talk about maybe McClellan is just a traitor. Maybe I don't know that many people really accused him of out and out treason. I think it was just incompetence that most people, but people said, hey, he's a Democrat and he's not really fully behind the war effort. All right. So that's the end of the 7 days. They started on June 25th and they go to July 1st. It's not exactly 7 days, but hey, close enough, right? Round up. After the battle, McClellan sends Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, a telegram. And listen to this. You're going to hardly believe this. McClellan ends the telegram by saying, If I save this army now, I tell you plainly, I owe no thanks to you or to any other persons in Washington. You have done your best to sacrifice this army. Can you imagine saying that to your boss? You have done your best to sacrifice this army. Fortunately for McClellan, the telegraph officer at the War Department, this came because, McClellan didn't send these messages himself. He would dictate them, and he would have an officer send the message, and then an officer would get the message, and it was in code, and it was in Morse code, and he would write it down. The officer at the War Department was so shocked by this, he took out these sentences. He didn't pass them on. So had he done that, McClellan's career might have ended a lot earlier. Maybe he should have. But anyway, so let's sum up these 7 days battles. The 7 days produced 20,000 Confederate casualties and 16,000 Union ones. So the South was actually on the offensive a lot of the time, but they lost more casualties because, as we're going to see throughout the Civil War, we touched on this a little last episode, because of the new technology, the rifled muskets with the mini balls. Whoever attacks usually loses, and whoever defends usually wins. But in spite of the fact that Confederates took more casualties, Confederate morale rebounds. Lee becomes a hero to the South. Northern morale, on the other hand, sinks. Lincoln calls for 300,000 more volunteers. He realizes we got to have more guys. On July 7th, Lincoln actually sails down to Virginia, to Fort Monroe, and he visits McClellan. Actually, he's at Harrison's Landing. And Lincoln visits McClellan. There's some famous photos of this. McClellan says, well, I didn't lose, I just failed to win. So McClellan's trying to put a good spin on it there. Spin is not a recent phenomenon. McClellan also asked for 50,000 more soldiers. Lincoln said privately that sending soldiers to that army is like shoveling fleas across a barnyard. Half of them never even get there. And so finally, in early September, Lincoln orders McClellan and his army back to Washington. I had Richmond in the notes, but he wishes Richmond.
Yeah.
So
I love that line that, he failed to win. I haven't become less popular. My appeal has become more selective.
Right. So McClellan, in his own eyes, he can do no wrong. It's always the fault of Lincoln, or it's the fault of Edwin Stanton, or it's the fault of, say, McDowell or one of the other army. McClellan had a complete inability not only to move quickly and to be aggressive and to attack, but he had an inability to accept responsibility.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors.
War has played a key role in the history of the United States, from the nation's founding right down to the present. Wars made the United States independent, kept it together, increased its size, and established it as a global superpower. Hi, I'm James Early, host of the Key Battles of American History podcast. In each episode, I discuss American history through the lens of the most important battles of America's wars. To start listening now, go to parthenonpodcast.com or search Key Battles of American History on your favorite podcasting platform.
The History of North America podcast is a sweeping historical saga of the United States, Canada, and Mexico, from their deep origins to our present epoch. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this exciting, fascinating, epic journey through time, focusing on the compelling, wonderful, and tragic stories of North America's inhabitants, heroes, villains, leaders, environment, and geography. I invite you to come along for the ride.
I'm Scott from the History Unplugged podcast. History can be a bit of a tongue twister with its weird-sounding names of people, places, and things, but it really isn't that confusing. History is the story of who we are and how we comport ourselves while soaring to victory in battles over forts, seaports, and cities that fortunately thwarted the schemes of villains and their blood sports, like the 1415 Battle of Agincourt. It's about legal battles in courts, about the contortion of torts over the retorts of consorts that turned into kangaroo courts. I exhort you to listen to History Unplugged on the podcast player of your choice, and you can listen to it while wearing shirts, shorts, skirts, skirts, or jean jorts. That's interesting. He would be a character study for somebody to look into, which begs the question, how did he lead Union forces? How did he get to the rank of general? And perhaps he was perfectly suitable for an antebellum period in America when forces are relatively light, when you can speak competently and eloquently and you're well-traveled on a subject. So the right man for the antebellum period, but not the right man for the Civil War period. I mean, that's the best sense I can make of it.
Yeah, I mean, I read a biography. I was forced to read a biography of McClellan when I took Civil War history as an undergrad. And as I read through it, I just kept wanting to reach through the book and slap him. Come on, man, goodness. Not just for his incompetence, but for his the statements he would make. And I've only read about half of the ones that would just make you jump out of your skin, some of the stuff he said. But the thing is you have to wonder, well, why did Lincoln pick this loser? I mean, come on. Why didn't you get somebody better from the beginning? But the thing is that Lincoln didn't know who was going to be good and who wasn't going to be good. We mentioned this in a previous episode, but none of these generals had ever commanded armies anywhere near this big. Some of them had only commanded most of them had just commanded very, very small units. I mean, McClellan had been an engineer in the Mexican War, and he got out of the army in the mid 1850s. He'd maybe gotten up to the rank. I don't know what rank. He might have been a captain before he got out. Promotion was very, very slow in the antebellum army. And so just Lincoln didn't know who was going to be ready for this new role, this big stage, if you will. And McClellan was very, very smart. So he thought, well, he'd had some success in West Virginia. So he thought, let's give him a shot. I always use this analogy, when, let's say you're a pro football team and you're the owner of the team and you need a new quarterback. Well, who are you going to get? Well, you don't have anybody in college who has the experience of running an NFL offense and leading the team. But you think, well, maybe if somebody did really, really well in college ball, they'll become a great NFL quarterback. And I don't know, are you much of a football fan, Scott?
I've been out of the country too long, so,
Oh, yeah. Well, I used to be a big NFL fan, and I can tell you this, that maybe like I don't have a stat in front of me, but maybe 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 5 really, really good college quarterbacks becomes a really, really good NFL quarterback. There's no way to predict. And so, McClellan had done well in everything he'd ever done before. And so Lincoln had no reason to think he wouldn't do very, very well as a commander of 100 and 120,000 guys.
Yeah.
And he found out the hard way. There's only one way to find out, is give them a shot. And if they fail, then try somebody else. And we're going to see that's exactly what's going to happen in the East.
Yeah. I mean, this could be seen in a lot of ways as part of the growing pains of American military culture, that people can be romantic about American military history, imagining that it's been more or less at the level of World War II. But that's definitely not the case in the 19th century. And there's also some other characteristics, too, that you see of generals as well. With Lee, as you mentioned earlier, that some of the problems that he had at Malvern Hill is that the attack was poorly coordinated. Now, not to go back to Napoleon again, but I really can't help it because that's what everyone else does. So, what can I do? But
well, why not? I mean, that's what the guys did at the time. He was their frame of reference. He was their benchmark, especially at the beginning of the war.
And for Lee, too, I'm not sure if this was explicit in this battle or just part of the general ethos, but a Napoleonic dictum is that if you're leading these different units, different corps in different directions, having them operate independently, you need an excellent officer corps. You have to have subordinates whom you trust to lead in place of yourself. Otherwise, the arrangement will not work. So what that means is that perhaps Lee was doing something similar. He entrusted officers, but that presupposes that they're well-trained. They can understand your ethos perfectly. They understand the decisions you would make. One criticism I've heard of Lee is that he would issue vague orders. From his perspective, we might think he's giving flexibility to the men on the field so that they can take on different circumstances as they see fit and issue their own more detailed order. But in the wrong hands, that could lead to chaos. So this is a characteristic that we're going to see again in the future.
Yes, and he's not the only one. There were some Union officers who made the same mistake of issuing vague orders. Correct.
All right. Well, I think that wraps things up pretty well. So we're starting to see these familiar faces emerge and come out of the woodwork, and we're also starting to see who's going to be with us for the long haul and who's going to get demoted. We'll definitely see that in our next episode, and I don't think you have to think too hard to guess who that is based on the track record of this episode. We are going to jump into the Battle of Antietam. Thanks for listening to the Key Battles in the Civil War podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show in the podcast player of your choice and leave us a rating and a review. This helps us grow and reach new listeners. You can also find maps of the battle sites, show notes to each episode, and plenty of other history info by going to keybattlesinthecivilwar.com.